Hi, this is Dino, and I want to talk to you today about how you can configure Apigee to dispense OAuth tokens via the client credentials grant type. Okay, so OAuth2 is specified in RFC 6749. And as part of that, there are different grant types. There are four described here: authorization code, implicit, password grant type, and client credentials. Now, the implicit has, since the publication of this standard, the implicit grant has been disrecommended. So we won't talk about that. Authorization code is interesting when you have third-party apps that are authenticating, and you don't want to have the authorization server handle user credentials. Client credentials is probably the simplest. That is the case where only the app is authenticating and getting a token. There's no user context associated with the token, no person or human. It's just the client app. And then the password grant is something that is a grant type that can combine authentication of the client, like client credentials, but also with user authentication. Now, I covered password grant in a separate screencast. Today I want to talk about client credentials grant. It's very simple. The request that the spec describes is a post to a token endpoint. The client credentials must be encoded in HTTP basic auth form. So this is a base 64 encoding of the client ID and client secret. And then the form payload should just have one parameter grant type, and it should have the value client credentials. So very simple. Then the authorization server authenticates the client. That is to say, it checks the client ID and secret to see that they're known and valid, and if so, can issue a token in response. So that's client credentials grant type in the specification. And let's have a look at how we can implement that in an Apigee proxy. So Apigee is very flexible. There's lots of different ways that you can configure it, but one way that you can configure an Apigee API proxy is to dispense tokens. In that case, we call it a proxy, but it's not actually proxying to anything remote. It's you might call it a loopback proxy. In my Apigee organization, I've got a proxy configured now. It is for dispensing tokens via client credentials. It receives an inbound request, does some validation, checks that the grant type is as expected, and if that's so, then it will you invoke the OAuth OAuth2 generate access token policy in Apigee to generate a token for client credentials. And this is the configuration of that policy. This is just a standard policy among the 35 plus policies that are included in Apigee. We specify the grant type, we can specify the expiry, and we can specify additional attributes if we want to attach to that token. Then the response will come back to the client. So very simple. The OAuth policy, this OAuth policy, implicitly verifies the client credentials that are registered for this for the app that's being sent in. So let's have a look at how it might look in practice. So I'll flip over to the trace tab. I'll start a trace session, and then I'll flip over to my terminal window. And what I want to do is invoke that. So let me just switch back, grab this. So we're gonna want to use curl. So I'll use curl -i just to see some additional information. The endpoint is cc/token. I need to specify the client ID and the client secret in that basic auth authorization header. And with curl, that's what that -u option does. It's going to base 64 encode this string and stuff it in the authorization header. And finally, I need the form payload, and that's going to be grant type equals client credentials. And that's it. So we pass the credentials, we pass the form that includes the thing that says we want a client credentials token, and we send that up into Apigee. And as you can see, I get an access token back. What good is this? This is not a JWT. This is an opaque access token. It's really just a random string of characters. It is good only for use within Apigee. So on subsequent calls, I can send that in, and the app can send that in the authorization header, and Apigee will grant access to the APIs it manages based on the validity of that token. This token does expire, so it expires in 30 minutes according to the configuration that I set up. So if I were to try to use this after that expiry, Apigee would reject it as an expired token, in which case the client would need to send in another request like this and get another token. Let's have a look at what it might look like if I passed in something a little different. What if I pass in password for the grant type? The OAuth policy is going to tell me, oh, that's an invalid grant type, or the API proxy, is going to send me back an error that says that's an invalid grant type. What if I send in incorrect credentials? So this is wrong secret. Let's make sure we get the intended grant type. I'll send in the wrong secret again. And Apigee is saying the client credentials are invalid. So it's that OAuth2 policy that is executing and sending back that error that says you've got an invalid client. So very simple. Apigee can be used to dispense OAuth tokens in the client credentials grant type. If you want to know more about OAuth, check the other screencasts in this playlist, including the one on password grant. Hope this helps. See you next time.